Big thanks to our sponsors who make the pudding possible. The American Camp Association of Illinois is made up of nearly 289,000 members, volunteers, campers, families, and professionals who believe in the power of camp. They work to disrupt the effects of poverty by providing fundamental services for children and families and learning opportunities for camp professionals. Learn more about ACA Illinois by visiting acail.org. You know the impact you want to make in a child's life, but figuring out the day-to-day details can be overwhelming. Let Camptivities help you make that impact by streamlining the creation of your camp activity schedules. Schedule a demo at camptivities.com.
Welcome to the pudding.
The sweet proof of research to back up what you already know about summer camp. My name is Travis Allison. My pronouns are he and him.
I'm Dr. Mandi Baker, and my pronouns are she, her.
Today we're talking with Laurie Brown, who's the Senior Director of Research and Education at the American Camps Association. I want to talk about Laurie's research and also some big projects that the ACA is working on. So Laurie, we'll start there if that's okay.
Thank you for having me for a second time. Do I get to say I'm a veteran guest?
Yeah, absolutely.
On the pudding?
Yeah.
I want to start by saying none of this is Laurie's research. This is camp research. A lot of what I do is speaking on behalf of many other brilliant researchers, research teams, research departments. We have the great fortune now at ACA of having such a kind of robust network of research that we do some of our own research, but not very much. So I'll do the best I can to breathe life into some of the work that other amazing people are doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Laurie, how did you get started as a researcher? What brought you into this?
Oh, so this is a good story.
Right.
If there are other kind of long timers out there, they might remember that back in the early 2000s, the American Camp Association launched its first ever national study of camps. And it was literally called the National Outcome Study. First time, it was really at the first moments when ACA was starting to think of itself as, maybe we should be doing some research on camp and as a contributor in that area. And my very good friend and mentor, who I mention on every podcast I can possibly get onto, Deb Oleski, was the director of research at ACA. And with the board and the kind of bunch of pieces came together, launched this large scale national study. That study involved a random selection of camps across the US. And I don't know if there were any Canadian camps. I don't think there were. I think they were US camps only. A miss. Maybe we can put that in the limitation section of that study. But it was in that random selection of camps to participate in that study where I became connected to ACA. I was working at a camp up in northern Wisconsin. I was a camp counselor who knew that she really liked camp and didn't know what that meant for my career. But when the director was, notified that this camp was randomly selected to participate in the study, she sent out a message saying, "Hey, I really need help coordinating this. We're going to have to give surveys to campers." There were like dollar bills that we had to give to campers or families as incentives, literally stacks of dollars of bills. We have to go some training. Who wants to help? And I said, I do. She said, of course, you put whatever on your resume you want. And that's what began. I raised my hand to do that. And that involved going to a training at what was then the Mid-States Camp Conference. I remember Chris Thurber was leading the training on how to do this study. And for whatever reason, I loved this business of surveys and dollar bills and collecting data, and something clicked in me. And so I would say that was the beginning of my research career and ended up pursuing a degree in kind of outdoor education, but kind of felt like camps was going to be a thing. I didn't discover research until well into my master's program, but it all started at camp.
That's all good stories begin.
Yes. Well, and I think we should mention your pedigree. I know that we don't do this much in the camp world, but certainly in the academic world, we talk about the pedigree to some degree. I think we do it a bit tongue in cheek, the camp researchers, but we were at a research evaluation committee meeting, and there was a discussion about the pedigree. And probably more, I like the conversation of the family tree of camp researchers, that one inspires another and a branch grows, and they grow their own branch and their own twigs and their own leaves, and then those go on to grow on their own branches. So do you want to talk a moment about the family tree? Because it's a very well-connected, but beautiful people in this family tree.
Yeah, a tree. And thank goodness we now have language of ecosystems, that trees talk to other trees and trees are connected to so many other species. So I can tell you a little bit about the tree that I found myself a part of. I grew up in Chicago, went to University of Illinois, never really planned on, going into academia, wanted to be a sport med person. But in that, picked up this minor in outdoor education. And that was about when the whole camp thing was starting to click. Like, I actually really love camp. How can I make a career out of this? But in that was the outdoor piece, was really just, I really want to be outside all the time, is what led me to the University of Utah. Purely the mountains. No other reason. I was
That's
going to be
hilarious.
that 2 years ski bum, work in the mountains, and a master's degree just to justify my time there and then be out. I did get a master's in parks, recreation, and tourism. I wouldn't have called that my home or my chosen field. It's
Yeah.
just where my undergraduate training kind of led me. And then this love now of the outdoors. So that degree really anchored that there is a career, there is work to be done, there is a whole lot to learn within that outdoor education space. But it was really during my master's degree where I got to hang out with PhD students and said, that's really what I want to do. Like, I just loved the questions and the depth of thinking and the ability to amass tools to go out and answer some of these questions. My PhD is also in parks, recreation, and tourism from the University of Utah. It was somewhere in that mix that I got connected with Dr. Deborah Lesky, who was working with Dr. Jim Sibthorpe, Dr. Gary Ellis, some of these iconic folks in outdoor education and camp research world. And so I am the little birdie who very happily found an already robust tree, and I hung out in that tree for a very long time. I'm very proud, as you all know, that we've continued, the American Camp Association has continued a long-time relationship with the University of Utah. That is not because there aren't other amazing universities, but these questions lead to other questions, and we find ourselves in some momentum, which is pretty neat. So we do have some graduate students from the University of Utah now working with us to address some of those questions. But like I said, our tree is talking to lots of other trees, and very, very glad to now support graduate students at multiple universities and projects across multiple institutions. And so that's a little bit about the tree that I've hung out in for a little while.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And I think it's worth a mention to Carla Henderson, who was part of that. I think most of the people from my generation of researchers have had when I first met
Oh, it's
Carla,
a moment.
yeah, it is a moment, although she's the most unassuming human. So that's the part where it's kind of
Yeah.
ironic because she probably wouldn't sign up for that by herself, but we've
Yeah.
all assigned it to her. And likewise,
Absolutely.
Deb has a very similar demeanor and that humility and that sort of like she's really a facilitator and a connector. And I get that sense from everyone who's kind of come through those lines, Jim and yourself. And we're
Sure.
very lucky, like you said, to be now interconnected in quite an ecosystem. But I'd also say the graduates that I've met that have come out of that group of researchers have that really lovely, like humble, but deeply intelligent, deeply reflective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're thinking about a future out there, if you're listening, you're thinking about a future out there, yes, you can be a camp researcher. I get teased about it constantly. In fact, this trip I just got home from, that's how I was introduced. She's Dr. Camp. She's a camp researcher. And there's a lot of giggling, but we learned how to ask good questions. And all that study led us to ask a lot of really good questions. So,
Yeah.
yeah, lucky to
That's
be
true.
here. Okay. We're ready to ask you a bit more about some of the big projects. We definitely are getting feeds of information coming through all the multiple channels that information comes to us
Yeah.
from ACA. And in particular, we've been hearing a little bit about, ever since New Orleans ACA conference,
Mhm.
about a character development grant. And I will say it, you can say it, this is not a research grant. We're very clear about that. This is very much a programs and a camps grant. But, in our chat as we we're getting ready, you said, when we do stuff like this, we ask more questions, and asking more questions usually leads to research. So, Laurie,
Yeah.
tell us what kind of questions you'd like to ask or have answered about this character development stuff.
Yeah. Well, and gosh, I wish we could talk about why it is so important, why I feel so, I guess, feel like I need to make clear that I understand this is not a research grant, almost like apologize. Yeah. There is definitely a sense in spaces that I find myself in where I am often the lone researcher, where people say, whoa, wait. You invited her? Oh, wait. We're not talking about research this time. And it's weird because I do believe that the appetite for and the ability to consume research is just through the roof, especially among camp people. We don't have to convince folks that research is important anymore, but there are still communities and spaces outside of us, other stakeholders, that get really nervous when we talk about research, that it's going to be too expensive, it's going to take too much time, it's going to detract from, the real goal, which in the case of our Character at Camp initiative is about, getting resources into the hands of camps so that they can improve, expand, whatever their own character related programming. So I always like to say, yeah, we're going to talk about research, but not to the detriment of all that great program work that we're going to be doing. That's $28 million going out into the hands of camps to do character work. however they see fit. Yes, they'll have to apply for a grant. Not everyone can get one, but very open, intentionally so, because we're not going to pretend to say that we can even get, what do camps do? What do they need regarding character? We don't know. So what there is in related to research, one is, of course, we're going to bring a robust evaluation machine to this project, always looking to improve it as we go, to improve our own systems for grant type projects like this, and to make sure that we are making a difference. The funder wants to know that. And of course, we want to know that. Evaluation invariably involves things like surveys and collecting data from camps. And so if you're doing that to be able to document your impact, you might as well be tucking in a little research here and there. So the big question that we have that came on the heels of our impact study, which was really the first to really say that the quality of the camp experience, actually what happens at camp, how a young person experiences camp, is the strongest predictor of outcomes, right? We saw that play out through a longitudinal design in multiple different passes. What we need to do now is take that question and test it in a experimental-ish way. And I use a lot of ish because I think I too am scared when I start thinking about it like an experimental design. Like that can be really cumbersome and actually really squish the human experience. And that's not exactly what we're trying to do. But in a grant project like this, we have the great benefit of multiple waves of granting, of lots of camps coming in and sharing information with us. It really could be the first time we get to compare, have a comparison group of camps who are doing this versus camps who are doing that. And so that in terms of a design opportunity is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
The question, however, that needs to be answered is, does program quality improve outcomes, right? So in our impact study, we saw a relation between the two, and it was from the perspective of campers and parents. Now we need to actually test what we'll call a program quality intervention, which is really an annual cycle of training, assessing for program quality, planning improvements, and then doing that again. Does that actually lead to specific outcomes? And of course, in this case, those would be character-related outcomes. So trying to make that causational linkage between program quality and now outcomes is what we're just starting to conceptualize within this design, where we could have a set of camps doing a program quality training and then a set of camps not. And then we can compare those, right? So there's some really neat opportunity in this project that does not negatively impact the grant program or all the money going to camps, et cetera.
Well, I think that's helpful to put out there for non-research brains, is that causation is an incredibly hard thing to de-thread from the tapestry of living and
Mhm.
actually be able to say this thread goes from here to here. That's actually a really tricky thing to do. It's fairly unusual in humanities or social science research to do as well. So what you're talking about is kind of the gold standard of what we hope for, all these kind of what you're talking about technically, to be able to do that causation piece. And there's lots of great research about this at camp, but has never really tackled causation because of the level of sophistication as part of research, arguably. So, like what you're putting out there is pretty exciting stuff. I remember we had a bit of a moment. It is a very nerdy moment, but it was a bit of a research nerd moment. We're like, oh my goodness, we can actually look for this thing.
Yeah.
So it's very exciting to hear. And like you said, the grant program, the way it's set up and designed with the waves, you get cracks at it. You get multiple
Yeah.
chances to have a look at it and to tweak. And that is also fairly unusual from a research point of view too. So exciting
Yeah.
stuff. I hope
Yeah, more
it
to
all
come.
falls into your lap.
It's still very, I'll use the word mushy these days. Mushy in terms of we have some mushy ideas, but in terms of the detail of how this played out, working with several different groups and researchers to help us kind of say, what's possible and what does this look like from an implementation point of view.
Okay, well, we have a question for you. How are you and the ACA thinking about research these days? You tell us how you and ACA are trying to conceive of research as it is and stands right now. What's the dreams? What are you hoping for?
Oh, I love this question. And this might be a little bit more of me. I mean, since you offered, I might just let Laurie talk a little bit in third person. What was that? I don't know.
We're handing you a magic wand. I love the magic wand question. If I can give you a magic wand, you could do whatever research you wanted, Laurie. No. Well, let's start.
Well,
How is
yeah.
ACA and yourself conceiving of research and your relationship to research at the moment? And what are you thinking about? What does that magic wand of the future look like?
Yeah, thanks. And I love this question. I will say we are thinking about research more expansively and creatively than ever before because we now have resources with which to do that.
Mm.
And that's primarily through numerous grant projects that have allowed us to really build capacity and to actually do research in new ways, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is a really good moment for that question. But I want to kind of lay one underlying assumption that is really at the center of our team and how we're thinking about research. There's several in here, so let me try and bake this into one. One is this idea that we need more participant-centered, community-centered, youth-centered research. This idea of researchers going into camps, just like researchers going into marginalized communities in all these ways. I mean, the entire research world is starting to realize all the traditions of oppression that exist in traditional methods. And so that attempt to build that ethos is really driving how we're thinking about research. And in camps, it just doesn't work. You can't just walk into a camp and say, here, give out this survey to your campers and there's your study. The number of conversations we've had about, the perfectly designed study and then a tornado rips through camp and there it goes, right? So camp is a very unpredictable place as it has to be. So trying to use camp at a traditional research sense just doesn't work. So what that's kind of pointing to for us, one is mixed methods research. We really need to be thinking multidimensionally. Anytime we're asking questions, how can we get insight into those questions from multiple ways? So surveys and interviews and observing and secondary research, all different ways we can look at that. The second bit, and I don't think we're doing this at all, frankly, but is going directly to young people, staff, go to the camp. What do you want to know? And really flipping that script. So I think some of those pieces are starting to really inform how we're thinking about research. We have a long way to go, for sure. What is playing out in practice, which hopefully represents some of what I just described in terms of ethos, is this now approach to, I'm going to use this word, innovation. This has happened sort of accidentally, whereas research on camps historically was either a research institution going, my own dissertation was about an intervention, a training that I did with staff. And then I gave out a bunch of surveys and I said, oh, did the training work? Literally, there was an oil spill in the middle of my dissertation. So it didn't work. So to my point, that camp is a very lousy petri dish for research. What we're realizing now is that maybe perhaps a way, not around some of the unpredictability of camp, but through it and in it, is to engage, bring camps to the table. And with our grant opportunities that we've had, we now have the option to do that. And so the way that's playing out in a couple specific instances is that we receive money from a funder and then we put that back out to camps. And they submit a proposal or a new project. We actually didn't even ask them to submit proposals. We said, hey, do you want to work on this cool thing?
Yeah.
Here's the money. Come hang out with us. And working together now in a community of learning where they will identify areas of improvement in their own camps to build plans to try and improve that thing, test it, did it work or not, and then plan to improve. And we call that a community of practice. But within that is this larger approach to what we're calling innovation. And we didn't make up innovation, but bringing innovation into what we're now thinking about in how we do research. So, always keeping a strong eye towards evidence-based needs of the field and youth development more broadly, but now also looking to other stakeholders, funders, partners, say, okay, how can we come together to create opportunities to innovate now, to come up with these solutions for the field? And so this is what we're really building in terms of how you research is now this innovation muscle. And it's largely because we have these resources through external grants and largely because camp folks are saying, hey, I have a problem that needs to be solved. I'll apply for this grant and I'll come hang out in this community of practice. We can learn together. And so it feels far more akin to what I'm talking about with this kind of community-driven research is that now it's literally camps identifying solutions, testing them. Do they work? Do they not work? And then we get to listen and learn from that and then share that back out with the field.
Sorry, it's just my passion too. I'm interested in how we bring people together and share as much as possible. So what are the mechanisms that you're hoping to get other than people going to the ACA National Conference and presenting stuff there? What are the mechanisms of that community of practice that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Travis. And I think that a lot of that is still forthcoming. I mean, our projects to date where we've done this kind of innovation hub have been very small. And so We bring folks together. There was one particular project where we actually asked our grant recipients to create posters to describe their programs and then did a poster display at the national conference with the idea that then others could look and see and interact with them.
Mhm.
And that was fine, but it was a small project and it was at national conference. So of course, only a few people really had access to it. With our character initiative, a huge dimension of that work is not only sharing stuff out with the field, but building a robust and accessible platform for people to access, you know, training, curricula, best practices, video. I mean, you name it, just really
Yeah.
harnessing what works in the field. One thing we know for sure, and I'm sure you two know this, is that camp folks, one, are incredibly innovative, and they've had to be to
Yeah.
survive in a really crazy industry, and also incredibly generous. And so, love to share what's worked and what hasn't worked. And so, this is how we're really thinking about again innovation: is that we provide the time and space. The folks in the field can come together, and then of course, once we start to identify solutions, we need to test it and then adapt and scale over time. So it's just because one person did it doesn't mean it's like a great solution for everybody. There are methods we can use to then, as we test it, then share. Once we feel like there's enough evidence that it works in this particular context, then we can share that out with the field.
Well, I think you jumped on exactly what I was going to get in there is I've never met a group of more innovative, creative people. They're some of the craziest problem solvers I've ever met. I remember listening to a marketing podcast talking about sometimes when the constraints are the tightest is when you come up with the wildest solutions because you are just so boxed in. And camps, you have to get
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah, he compares it a bit to Mick Jagger. The smaller the stage, the wilder the moves, because he had to dance and he had no space to do it. And so I think camp people are good at dancing like Mick Jagger. They're, limbs going all directions, getting in the groove and just making it happen. Like just make it happen, get it done with fairly limited resources. And what we know from creativity research is that actually is pretty effective. That's where we get some of the craziest outgoing kind of solutions. So can't people are well positioned for the innovation. What I find most fascinating is when you talk about communities of practice. I know I can get lost in my own thinking, so this is a little bit Seinfeld and existential, but it asks the question of what really is then the relevance of the expert researcher? Like, what's the relevance? If we're really good at learning from one another and camps, people tend to be very community oriented, tend to be sharers. I mean, I knew I had a problem with my dissertation at actually stopping people from talking and signing up. Like I was
Yeah.
oversubscribed this one time at band camp. And I was like, okay, we're cool. I got all the data I need. So it raises that question of, what is the relevance of the expert researcher and why do we need those people and what role do they play in that space? So I'm curious to hear what you think that role is or how you envision it.
Oh, I love this question. This kind of gets me back to these foundational pieces that our team is really trying to build because it's humility, it's self-awareness, it's ability to get out of the way. I think the role of the expert researcher is changing, especially as we've recognized these traditions of oppression. And frankly, how that plays out in camp is just a lot of muddy research.
Yeah.
Like waltz into a camp with a survey has not left us with, well, let's just say stuff that would vie for NIH funding, which is not the goal, but it's a messy place to do research, right? And so I think the role of the researcher, at least how we're thinking about it, is to bring the toolbox
Hmm.
and some knowledge of how tools may or may not work in a given situation, but then always to be checking that with community, with members, the people who are most affected by the problem at hand or most best impacted by the solution, right? And so I think it's that humility and self-awareness piece to be like, my role as a researcher perhaps is to set the table, but then to get out of the way. Not entirely. You can't be passive. Like you still have to be in there making sure everyone is getting what they need and then listening. A lot of listening. And then checking back with the community and say, did I hear this in the right way? Oh, I didn't? Okay, how can we improve this? This is what we're working on, but I think it's a big change in research in general. Like Mandy, you and I have talked about until the incentive systems in research shift. I don't think we can really fully dive now into this more kumbaya approach to research, right? Like there's always going to be pressure to have the randomized control trials. And frankly, the study that I described around quality and outcomes is to better position us for, these federal funding opportunities that we've applied for in the past and have gotten a hard pass because like camp, what's camp? And we actually don't really know because we haven't been able to test that in the way that they like to see those things, kind of codified.
I think it's your line about camp is not a good petri dish because it's a constant moving, fluctuating space. And you
Yeah.
want a petri dish to sit still and be the same matter that you applied your thing to begin with.
Yeah.
When I think about that researcher role in this kind of rethought of or upside down strategy of centering the person we want, their knowledge is, the participant, the camp, the decision makers. One of the things in trying to do that, I keep thinking about for myself is, well, there's two parts I see the researcher. We have this wonderful luxury, if not privilege, of getting to spend time to learn stuff so that when we hear what they're saying, we can connect it back into these bigger, broader systems of
Yeah.
knowledge and literature and proven and evidence and stuff. So we can hear a thing and go, oh, yeah, we know that works. Another, I think, special quality, and I know I've obviously spent some time on this, is the X-ray vision. So I was reading Sarah Ahmed, who writes some beautiful stuff about, actually she does a lot of research on happiness. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this chase of happiness, but she talks about seeing in ultraviolet. And once you can see in ultraviolet, you can't not see ultraviolet anymore. And I think that's one of those privileges of research is you learn to see the world in lots of different ways and explore that quite deeply. So that when you walk into a social situation, it's hard not to see all the dynamics of a thing. For me, anyways, as a sociologist, where I'm like, oh, that couple's having an argument. Oh, she's pissed. He's withdrawing. Oh, okay. And it's just being able to, I know we're all nosy eavesdroppers at the coffee shop or the grocery line, right? But it's being able to think through, I see it. Now I also understand the whole systems of how that works due to the knowledge that's been collected and shared. And I think when it comes to doing that real participant-centered, youth-centered research, the ultraviolet has let me be able to point out to them the expertise that they hold that they don't see and that they take for granted. Yeah. And for me, it's like there's lots of people doing amazing stuff in camps, but they don't even see it. They just go, yeah, that's my everyday. And I'm like, no, dude, that's special. So being able to have all that knowledge behind me and see it and go, actually, what you're doing is innovative. This is what we're looking for. It's just you've been doing it and got so used to it, you didn't realize it was innovative anymore. Well, guess what? It's cool. Talk to me. I will capture it as best I know how. I will share it as best I know how. I think that's one of the superpowers is like all that learning lets you see stuff and then really empower the speaker. Like you've got something amazing to share, speak up. So I'm hoping those systems, that approach to research really makes a big shift.
Yeah.
And even the stuff that the ACA is doing through Project Real Job is starting to give people language outside of what we know to be camp skills, to be like bigger picture skills that come out of working in the industry.
Yeah. And there's a lot more say that connects into a different, I wouldn't say body of work, but maybe forthcoming, around working in camp. That's obviously a parallel thread in everything that we're doing. And the more we know about working camp, the more we know it actually runs very parallel to attending camp. So holding those two things simultaneously is critical as we, really continue to explore this industry.
That's great.
Scheduling affects every camper and every staff member's summer. It's easy to make mistakes. It takes a ton of time. Bottom line, scheduling is hard, but it doesn't have to be. Let Camptivities help you create a balanced and engaging schedule without the mistakes and without those long days and late nights. Here's what Camptivities can do for you. Auto scheduling, camper scheduling, group scheduling, elective scheduling, manual adjustments, over 60 different reports, and tons of customizable settings. That and so much more. And don't wait until the new year. Now's the time to find a better way to schedule and save 15% for the first year. We would love to show you the next big thing in camp. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat. Let us help you get away from your desk and back out to camp. Did you know that ACA Illinois' primary work is getting young people to camp from communities that traditionally don't attend? This includes providing services to 9,000 kids and adults from low-income communities throughout the state of Illinois annually. ACA Illinois has deep roots in using camp as a way to create social change in local, state, and national communities, including creating equitable access for all children to attend camp. ACA Illinois loves to try new things and believes it's how we create the most dynamic impact for our campers, staff, and community. This is why ACA Illinois always jumps at the chance to collaborate with content experts and countless volunteers to develop new and innovative programming. Ready to help us achieve this mission? Join us at acail.org. Are you a camp professional looking for community? Are you a camp interested in accreditation but don't know where to start? Are you looking to grow your career? Are you looking for ways to give back? Reach out to us at info@acail.org and let's get you connected.
Are there other pieces of the ACA research, Laurie, that the body of all the research at camp, let's not say ACA research, is there stuff there that you're super excited about that others may not know about?
So the biggest question that we have that I think every camp should have, I'm going to use a should here, is how do we make camps more accessible and a space of belonging for all young people?
Yeah.
Hard stop, right? And so this is at the core of how we're thinking about research and this innovation piece. And so I'll say kind of two things here in terms of research and an innovative
Mhm.
project we're working on. With respect to research, we've done a bit, and primarily this is a part of our impact study to understand barriers and constraints to camp attendance and
Yeah.
working at camp from the perspective of youth and families and staff who are already at camp. So the assumption being that they somehow navigated these barriers and got there and learned a lot about the barriers themselves, but really have never had the opportunity to speak to youth, families, potential young people who could work at camp who aren't accessing camp, who might not know that camp exists, or who might have just really negative understandings of what camp is. And so this is an area where we're really starting to explore some opportunities, have a couple potential studies to really talk to, in this case, families and young people. I think we're going to start there. And the question is, what do you want for your children in the summer? I guess to walk back one second, I mean, we've only had the opportunity to understand barriers from the perspective of youth and families who attend camp. We've also only asked about camp as we know it to be.
Right.
Like,
Yes.
what happens when we start from absolute scratch and talk to families across the country of all different
Mhm.
backgrounds and values and types? Say, what do you want for your kids? Like, what if camps actually understood what the communities want, and especially the communities who we are trying to serve, but just don't historically,
Yeah.
right? We've always had kind of, if you build it, they will come model. Well, maybe it's time to flip that on its head. And, I think a lot of camps are thinking that way. So I'm not going to lay claim to own that, but I am hopeful that the ACA will be able to provide insights from families, from a massive kind of population perspective around needs, values, and barriers in summer. And then we can really start to design experiences to those needs. That's a research piece. In terms of a project piece, project that we're doing now in its second iteration, this is a part of our pathways work based on the assumption, this is actually not an assumption, this came out of several different research studies, both in camps and well beyond, that for young people to feel like they belong in a space, especially in a out of school time space, but I would imagine schools too, they need to see themselves in the teachers, the leaders, the adults in those spaces. And if they don't see themselves, they're not going to feel like they belong. If they don't feel like they belong, they're not going to come back. And worst case scenario, there's going to be some harm caused. So recognizing that we need absolutely for camps to be more accessible and spaces of belonging for everybody, we need to start with that leadership piece. And I know that that's work that we've been trying to, I don't know if get moving is the right word, but what we've identified through some past research is CIT programs, counselor and training programs, as a potential, what I call kind of like disruption moment. Like there's this really tight closed loop between a camper who goes on to be a CIT or a leadership, in training, then to a staff, right? And it's only campers with the resources to be able to do that, and only campers whose parents went to camp that are going to enter into that cycle, right? So it's pretty closed off. And how are we going to disrupt that? So CIT programs, we know, are super ubiquitous across camps. Most camps have something like that. With all the challenges around staffing, most camps
Mhm.
are starting to look at their CIT type programs as a real critical component, future staff. But also in the workforce development world, way outside of camp, like there are whole organizations and the government pointing to the need for workforce development among 13 to 18-year-olds. like, what a better place to do that than at camp? And
Yeah.
our own research points to that. Like, camp is the perfect place to practice being a working person.
Mhm.
And so we're doing some work now with the funder and with a cohort of camps who are going to be identifying some innovative solutions to increasing access to and belonging within CIT programs. So that's really specific to that CIT space as a way to build these more accessible pathways. And so I like to always point to that because that is a program or an innovative approach that was inspired by research and will result in promising practices for the field. So this kind of flow between research, innovation, and education is really exemplified in that pathways work.
Laurie, what part of the whole of camp deserves more study and isn't getting it yet?
Gosh, a good question. Only pick one. I mean, we have
Right.
some significant challenges to the field. Of course, you all know this.
Yeah.
Anyone who's listening knows this. And so if I had to pick just one, I mean, I think the family piece is huge. We can't
I agree.
possibly survive into the future until we understand the communities we're trying to serve
I
and
agree.
the communities that we're not serving and their needs to.
Yeah.
But I also believe we cannot survive into the future if our own people are not whole. And
Right.
I think this industry chips away at people pretty dramatically. And we're seeing that
Yep.
play out. Even career professionals, camp professionals are leaving the field and saying, no more. I can't take
Mhm.
any more. Long hours, challenging work environments, unpredictability. I think parents and families are presenting their own challenges.
Yep.
And so until we really understand how to recruit and retain a healthy professional workforce through practices of well-being and community and professional development, professionalization, compensation, until we can really
Yep.
start paying people a living wage in this field, then I don't know how much longer we got. Yeah.
When I was in Australia, I was at an ACA, Australian Camps Association conference. They're a little bit smaller, where
But they're so
Australians
cool. I love going to
Yeah, the
those.
Australians are cool, but there's maybe at a big one, there's 150 people, not 1,500.
Yeah.
But I do remember the Australians are known, they're called larrikins, are known for stirring shit. And I remember a buddy getting up and asking a question and said, I was sitting on a panel with 3 other academics, experts, and they said, what's better, camp in Australia or camp in Canada? And I thought, oh, you horrible toad. You should never put me in that situation. What am I going to say? And it actually led to the first paper I ever published because I talked about the magic of, and I know Travis has beef with the word magic, but I, broke it down in a social science kind of way, what the magic of camp was in North American kind of context of summer camp.
Mhm.
But one of the things I found most outstanding about what Australia was doing at the time, and I was in Queensland, which is one of the states, is it had created like a government regulated award wage that was for outdoor educators and outdoor recreation facilitators, and it professionalized it really set the bar of what the rules were in terms of employment, in terms of HR practices, and what would protect that, at least from a really tangible mechanical, protect burnout in that way. And I appreciate, obviously my research has been about emotional labor for 15 years, so I appreciate that all of the bricks and mortar will not necessarily protect somebody from burnout. This kind of job is very psychological, emotional, and so that's where a lot of the drain comes from. But it certainly helps when you know that you're making enough money to take care of yourself and your family. You know you're going to go home at a certain hour every day, not every week,
Right.
every day, that you're going to have your 4 weeks annual leave and it's going to be paid for, that your health benefits are covered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So what it gave me quite by accident was a view of what a professional camp workforce could look like, and that it's actually quite doable and it's affordable. That's one of the greatest fears, is that if we pay the people who work in camps what they would get in a normal labor force, that
Mhm.
camps would implode and they would not be able to carry on. And it turns out actually you can do it and it can be done.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that insight, like you said, like it can be done. And that's the part that surprises me still, that conversation, it still kind of simmers under the surface. And why is it not on the surface and actively engaged?
Yeah, I
from
don't
a
know that we've
workforce
figured out how it can be done yet in the US. And I think that you raising the example of Australia just reminds me of how many opportunities we're thinking about this in our camp school partnership work. The rest of the world has some incredible uh, innovation of its own. Like we need to really listen and learn, because every time I do say that about living wage working at camp, both for our seasonal staff and our professional staff, I can feel my camp colleagues saying we are being crushed. In fact, our own data show that personnel are the single biggest expense, that profit margins are dwindling fast across all sectors of camps. And so to just say, just pay your staff more isn't really a solution. I think larger systems, families need to be willing to pay more, but also families are squeezed for childcare. So there's, like all things, a systems approach is necessary here. And we're thinking about that in terms of policy related to childcare and tax credits for childcare. And
Absolutely.
there's certainly some inputs that I think we have to at least try that take the pressure off of camps from just saying you got to pay your staff more. Because I believe that most camps are trying, doing the best they can.
I've been interested in this discussion we talked about in Camp Packer a number of times. I don't know how we get camp to be taken more seriously outside. I mean, we're taking it seriously with research, and I think that we're proving ourselves in so many ways, but we're still not taken seriously. And I don't know how we get taken seriously as an industry who has such incredible impact on kids and young adults. If we don't get together with everyone who's lumped under childcare and start to advocate as a childcare industry.
Yeah.
And everybody has their own reasons for siloing that. But if society doesn't take childcare more seriously, specifically in North America, there's lots of great examples around the world that take it much more seriously. But if we don't get together, I don't like we're all stuck in the same spot. I can't afford to pay people more because people can't, nobody can pay for what it actually costs to run a daycare or a summer camp.
Oh, it's such a huge need, Travis. And here too, I mean, this is a hot ball of wax. Let's start talking about childcare because there's been a lot of resistance to equate camps with childcare. I mean, there's licensing issues, but there's also just like fundamentally, like we're way more than childcare. But actually, we know through our own research that most families seek camps for childcare purposes, and that might change as their kids have a good time, and now they're going for other reasons. But that is the need, and if we can't fill that need, then we're really not playing a role in society. You know, so that's an important one.
Yeah, that perception of what camp is. We did a survey with some people, we just sort of friends of friends. We got across North America parents who had not or would not send their kids to overnight camps. It's just so interesting, the perspective of those parents, that we're looking at it from a communications and marketing perspective. Like, how do we talk better to those parents? How do we address exactly what you're talking about? How do we know what parents want, and how does camp answer that?
Right.
Their number one answer is camp's just not safe.
Yeah.
And it's so many of us, it's like, this is like an airplane. Like, this is one of the safest childcare things you can do.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah.
That I don't know if call that what you will. That is the big thing that no one wants to talk about is a lot of communities still find camp or feel that camp is not safe.
Yeah.
And this is somewhat related, this idea of like, I would never send my kids away. I
Yeah,
like
totally.
my kids.
Yep.
Well, which as a parent is a dangerous. There's some moralization there that I don't really like. Let's just put it that way. But
Of course.
it's very strong.
Mandi, I know you have one question, but I want to throw one little interesting statistic thing that I learned related to what you said, Laurie. In talking to folks from the Foundation for Jewish Camps this year, their research showed that 2/3 of senior leadership has changed in the last 2 years. So
Wow.
2/3 of the year-round full-time camp staff within the Jewish camps, because they're the ones that have the studies, has changed in the last 2 years.
Mhm.
That's been an interesting thing for Go Camp Pro to figure out, because people don't know us now because it's not the same people, and people are so new to the job that they're not able to consider sort of what we provide, which is kind of the next level of camp and how to think that way.
Well, and it changes our work that we need to be educating, re-educating constantly, and maybe start to be more intentional about turnover. Is there opportunity to say, actually, this work is hard and is not in most cases meant to be a 10-year plus career? So what can we be doing, especially with program and director level staff, to create these more intentional 3 to 5 year arcs, right? And I didn't make this up. I have other colleagues who've been thinking about this for a while. That I think is really interesting. And if we can plan then because that's the other problem with camps is there's not unlimited mobility for folks who come in as a program director. There maybe 4 or 5 program directors, only one director. Where are folks going to go? Maybe if we can be more intentional about that. I don't know if turnover is the right word, if just mobility or growth.
I like the term life cycle, that there's a life cycle to this job. There's seasons to this job, and there's a time where it doesn't line up with where you're at. It does also raise interesting questions about what knowledge management, the fact that a
Mm.
lot of the knowledge just sits inside people's heads and
Yep,
hearts. And so as soon as
100%.
they walk out, all of that stuff goes with them. And
Yeah.
how do you capture that? Can you capture that? Can you put it in artifact? Camps run a little bit like indigenous knowledge systems where there's a lot of oral traditions and ritual. And then if that person, the storyteller, is no longer there, or the most experienced storyteller is no longer, a lot of those stories just don't carry on. And
Yeah.
then by consequence, the values and habits that go with it. I mean,
Yeah.
the other thought that this brings up for me is, and again, Australian context, look, it's a smaller population, so it's easier to capture. The context is very different. So,
Mhm.
that we can do certain things and we can't do others. And just as a side asterisk, there's not a lot of summer camp in Australia. There's a lot of school camp.
Right.
There's
Right.
not a lot of summer camp because of the way that that context works.
Sure.
But one of the things I was often reading was a Deloitte report talking about the cost of recruitment and training, and it's billions of dollars. It's billions. So the costs of camp in that re-education recruitment effort is very, very high. So then when you're
Mhm.
talking about, well, just pay them more, I was like, well, I've already invested all the money just to get them in the
Right.
door, and to get them up to speed. So when you have a life cycle job involved, it's going to be a more expensive industry, arguably.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I've got another question for you, which is, who is a researcher you would recommend that we learn more about?
Well, we've already named some of the icons that if you really just want to hang out with incredibly wise, generous, humble people, those are all my favorites, of course. But there is a researcher that I've been fangirling about for a long time. She's not a camp researcher, but I heard her talk at a conference long ago, and I think her work really lends itself to how we think about training staff. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Jones, and she's at Harvard University and runs a lab specific to social emotional learning. So most of her work is around SEL, what it is, what these frameworks are. For researchers thinking about SEL, her work is going to be really kind of cool. For practitioners, if you want to know more about how social emotional learning might line up with another set of words, positive youth development, she has some nice tools that maps some of these words against each other. What I heard her speak about, which really clicked for me, was this notion of kernels of practice. And the idea here is that researchers, and we've talked about how we often get a bad rap, and in this case, I think it's for good reason, sit in our kind of isolated world and develop what we call interventions, right? So this is a thing that is going to make all the things better. Go do the thing. And it never works. We call this intervention. Doesn't work in education, doesn't work in out of school time because gosh, there are people involved. And where there are people, there's a whole lot of unpredictability. And so Dr. Jones's work really kind of took that thing of saying, okay, these interventions, which think of it as like this big box that you take off a shelf and you go take it to camp and say, do this, don't change anything, don't omit anything, do it exactly as I told you to do it. And the camp folks, again, this is what I did for my dissertation. I literally had a curriculum that came in a box that I went to this camp and said, okay, we're going to train on these things. It doesn't work because, we have our systems, we have our culture, we have a whole lot of stuff that happens when we don't expect it to. And so what we need is the ability to break down those interventions, the big box, like take all the stuff out of the box into their most bite-sized pieces. And Dr. Jones calls these kernels of practice. What are these essential elements of practice? And the example I always like to give is that counselors are trained to learn and use a camper's name. Like elemental. It couldn't be more basic. But the point is that that's the thing that now a camp staff person can be trained to do, and they know how to plug it in all the places in which they could and should learn a camper's name. And so this idea is great because one, it acknowledges the expertise in the field that our camp staff, even if they're a very first year counselor, have expertise because they are in the field and doing it. And so instead of giving them an intervention that basically assumes you don't know what you're doing, do this, do the box. Kernels of practice says you do know what you're doing. Here's a toolbox of stuff that you're going to be able to pull from and then put into play in a way that makes sense given the culture of the place where you're working, the needs of the campers at the time, your own expertise. And so I think this is a really promising approach and honestly how we've started to think about tools and resources for camps. Like we can't give camp folks this just the box. We have to give them the most kind of basic pieces parts and then also the message that you do know what you're doing. You are the expert of your own work. You know better than anybody. Here's some promising practices that we have evidence of, that these things work, and here's how you might put them together. So I think Dr. Jones is pretty cool. She's a great speaker. That's who I would recommend
Amazing.
hanging out with.
And for folks listening or watching us on YouTube, we'll look for the show notes and we'll put a link to Dr. Jones and her page at Harvard, and we'll get to some
She
of those
doesn't know
resources.
me, by the way, so don't bother like name dropping me. She's like
Laurie Brown sent
pretty
us
important
all.
stuff.
Okay, that's good. Laurie, where should folks go to find the research that ACA is doing? Like, what is the place to go to figure that out?
Yeah, acacamps.org/research. New hot off the press is our National Camp Economic Impact Study. The data in that thing is just mind-blowing. It's 400 pages full of appendices, all kinds of tables, if you really like the numbers. The gist, it's really kind of in 3 parts. One is a census, so the first of ever count of camps in the U.S. Sorry again to my Canada friends, but intent, there's such a robust report that the Canadians can pick it up and do their own version. A lot of how-to in there. So we have the census that is just profound. Never in my career have we actually known how many camps exist. So that's pretty cool. Next is the survey of camps, which is really kind of how we do industry surveys year after year, things like enrollment trends and revenue and things like that. See some of that. And then there's the economic impact piece, where the researchers at the University of Michigan who conducted the study took those 2 pieces and then were able to create models of the national economic impact of camps. And it's like 76 billion. I mean, it's a number. It's pretty cool. We like that. But more importantly, now we have this state by state. So at least in the US, advocating for camps at the state level is incredibly powerful and important. And now our folks in their states have literally one-pagers they can take to policymakers and say, look, this is how many camps we have, how many campers, our economic impact. Like, we matter. So please pay attention.
Yeah.
It was a pretty cool study. You can find it on acacamps.org/research.
And that's how I found out about that project, was camp directors who were doing advocacy posting some of the very first, not leaks, they were using it on purpose, of course, but the first things I saw about that study.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Can I say one other thing
Please.
about that study, though, that I think is really interesting, just because we've hit on workforce, is the fact that we now see on paper how overwhelmingly seasonal we are as a workforce. And that is both affirming and also is a real push to figure out how we're doing staff, because we're like 80% seasonal workforce, and there's no other comparable industry in the United States that relies that heavily on young college age workers. And so it just feels like a real imperative to figure that piece out.
Absolutely. Well, Laurie, we want to say thank you so much for your time and for joining us and sharing your wisdom and wandering through big ideas with us and waving magic wands and all the things. We've really appreciated your time here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, listeners, if you didn't know, now you know, Camp Pros.